Welcome to Healthy Cooking, and if you saw last week's episode, we talked about three things that are really bad for Canadians, or we generally get too much in our diet and we should be cutting back, and that's fat, sugar and salt. That doesn't mean that we don't need sodium in our diet. We do need sodium in our diet. We do need a certain amount of fat in our diet, but generally speaking we get too much of those three things in our diet. So a healthy way to cook is to cut back on those three things, and we're going to deal with salt today. Salt is a killer that we don't normally think about. Salt contains 40% sodium. We only need a little bit of sodium in our diets. Salt, for example, we just need about a teaspoon. We need about 2,300 milligrams of sodium in our diet per day. So the problem is not the salt that we add from the salt shaker. So when you see salt like this in a little shaker and you're only putting a little bit on, you might think, well, I'm not adding too much sodium, or this is the typical salt that you buy in the big containers. You may think, well, I'm not adding too much salt. The problem isn't with the salt that we add to food. It's more with all the ingredients that we put in a dish or convenience foods. Everything seems to have salt in, and that's where we get too much sodium in our diet. So the dish today, we're going to look at how do we season a dish without using too much salt. How do we season a dish, get the flavor out without using too much salt. And I'm going to talk about some good flavorings. We're going to talk about some bad flavorings that we can use. So the first thing, I'll get this dish started. It's a tarragon chicken stew. Very, very simple to make. We're going to start off with just a tablespoon of oil. The tablespoon of oil will just turn the heat right up. All we want to do is just get a tiny bit of color to the chicken. Color the chicken, you're going to get a little bit of flavor. We're going to add some white wine. We're going to talk about reducing white wine and using wine in cooking. And we're going to use a chicken stock today, and we're going to put as many different vegetables as you want. We're going to post the recipe at the end of the segment, but you can adapt the recipe to whatever you feel like. But generally speaking, it's a pretty straightforward recipe. I've taken some shredded chicken. So what we're going to do is try to brown the chicken. If we can brown the chicken, that would be great. Just get a little bit of color. You'll probably, in this case, need just a wooden spatula, especially if you're using a Teflon pan. And we'll just get just a little bit of color to the chicken. So let's take a look at some of the dishes, some of the ingredients that you get that are not very good. So if you take a look at most of the seasonings that you get in Canada now, this is a very popular one. I won't show you the name. It's a very popular seasoning. The very first ingredient on the label is salt, which means the main ingredient in this seasoning is salt. Now that goes for lots and lots. It's not just this particular brand. It's most brands, they list salt. So what you're really doing is buying very expensive salt if you want to use that. You might think, well, I'm going to buy myself a sauce, an Alfredo sauce. Take a look at the list of ingredients and you'll see that, first of all, there's some ingredients you can't pronounce, but right near the top is salt. So it's an easy way to season food is salt. What we want to do is we want to cut back on the salt. And the reason we want to cut back on the salt is that too much sodium in your diet will mean that your body will retain water. When you retain water, your blood pressure goes up, and that's going to be a tremendous burden on your kidneys. It's not good for cardiovascular disease, and it's not good for cancer. So all these killers, especially cardiovascular, that's the main killer in Canada. So we want to really try, if we can, to reduce the salt. And we know that we get too much salt in our diet. And when I say salt, I'm really talking about sodium, but we use them interchangeably now. So once I've got the chicken, and I can get just a little bit of color to the chicken, right? So just a little bit of colour to the chicken. Then what I can do is I can start looking at some flavor building ingredients. So this would be my onion and garlic. Generally speaking, I use lots of onion and garlic. If you don't like it, don't use it. I just like lots of onions and garlic in there. So what I'll do is maybe we'll cut the root off right now, and I'll shred this, and we'll put some sliced onions in there just to give kind of a little bit of texture to the dish. Okay, and we can pop that in. So we've got the onions going in, and we'll also put a little bit of garlic in there too. Onions and garlic. Now the garlic, you can do the same thing. If you don't want a strong garlic flavor, just dice it fine and you can pop it right in. Now this will add flavor. I usually put the garlic just a little bit later than the onion, but you can see now that the chicken has started to cook. By the time the chicken is almost cooked through, because I've shredded it, won't take long to cook, then we can add the garlic and the onions will start to break down and soften up. So this is the base of the dish. We have chicken, which we've browned slightly. We've put some onion, we've put some garlic in there. So we know we've got some flavor to start with. By browning the chicken a little bit, we're also adding flavor in there. So let's look at some good seasonings that we can put in here. So we said onions, garlic are both flavor builders. Some nice seasonings that you can use so you don't use as much salt, or use no salt. If you want to cut salt out of the food that you cook altogether, you can do that. But let's just say you want to add just a tiny bit of salt. Then lemon is a great addition to any dish, lemon juice. Lemon zest. So you're not looking at the white pith, the white part that's on the lemon. We're just looking at the zest part. The zest is the yellow part, and we can just take this and dice it up slow, nice and small. And that can get added right in with the chicken and the onions and the garlic, and that'll start to release its flavor. Lots and lots of flavor in the zest. It's going to break down as well. The other things that we can use, so you can see now we've got lots of nice colour into this dish. I'm going to turn the temperature down very slightly, and what we're going to do is take a look at some other ingredients that will give you a seasoned effect, but you won't actually be getting the salt. You just get the seasoning effect from it. We're going to be adding some wine. Now when you add wine, you always have a wine that you enjoy drinking, a nice table wine. You might like a Piet d'Or, a Cressman. This one is a Kim Crawford Sauvignon Blanc, usually a dry wine with chicken. And what we do is we use a wine that we enjoy drinking. That way it concentrates the flavor that you like to drink, you're going to get into the dish. It's no good getting a cheap wine, or, you know, let's say your granny gives you a wine for Christmas and it's horrible. Don't cook with it. It won't be delightful in the dish that you cook with. It'll still be horrible. So what you do with a bottle of wine that you get at Christmas that you don't really like, just re-gift it to somebody else. That's the best thing to do with that. So what we're going to do is just add a little touch of flour. So I'm going to add probably 2 teaspoons of flour, and this flour then will be cooking with the little bit of oil that we add at the start. So if we added 2 teaspoons of oil, we can add 2 teaspoons of flour, and it creates a little bit of a roux. And that roux is what's going to just give you a little bit of thickness. We don't want a thick, stodgy stew. We want a kind of a nice thin stew. That's how we make stews these days. We don't make those thick stews anymore. We just make a very light stew. So we're going to cook that a little bit, and it's okay if the flour browns ever so slightly. Don't worry about that. We'll get the other ingredients ready. The other ingredients that you want to put in here. I've got some potatoes. So just some small diced potatoes. They'll take about 15 minutes to cook. We're going to use a little bit of red pepper, almost like a a chicken a la king, if you like, where you put red and green peppers in. You could put red and green peppers into this. I'm going to put it in because it's going to add a little bit of colour to the dish. It's going to make it a little bit more attractive for presenting. I'm also going to add just a little bit of carrots are going to give you a little bit of flavour too. They're flavour builders. I'm just going to do little medallions of carrots for this dish. So we're going to chop those up, and we can add them in right now before we add anything else. Just let them go into the rest. I just want that flour to cook very slightly in there. So if it cooks in there, you can get it all in there, then you can add the rest of the vegetables. And in this case, you don't have to use red peppers. I just like carrots, red peppers. I think they're going to give a little bit of colour to the dish, but they're also going to add flavour, and means I don't have to use as much salt in the dish. So we'll pop that in, keep it cooking. The next thing is we're going to add, just give that a few more seconds so that that flour is cooked right in there, is we're going to add the wine. And as I said, make sure you use a wine that you enjoy drinking. It should be just a nice table wine. A $12 bottle of wine for a nice table wine is good. You don't have to buy kind of a vintage wine, and you don't have to go with a homemade wine, which may be not as good. So just a nice table. So actually, I shouldn't say that. Some homemade wines are excellent, so you can use it, but it should be a dry wine. So we're going to add the wine, and we're going to cook that in. I had about a quarter of a cup to half a cup of wine. Let that cook in, and you'll see that with the flour in there, it'll start to thicken slightly. Now remember, we got the potatoes to go in here, so we're going to be adding chicken stock. But just for a little while there, what I like to do is turn the heat up, reduce the wine in there, concentrate the wine flavour, and then you're going to get that wine seasoning in there. We can add dried tarragon if you've got dried tarragon, or fresh tarragon. If you've got dried tarragon, add it in, because dried tarragon needs to release its flavour, so it needs a lot more time than fresh tarragon to release its flavour. So cook that right in as well. And that wine reducing now, you're going to get lots and lots of flavour. You already can smell that it's the wine reducing in there, and you can smell that wonderful flavour from the wine. What we're going to do, you'll see it's just starting to thicken up. You get those thickened juices in there. What we're going to do now is add our stock, keep the heat on high, and just reduce everything, the wine, the stock. You could let the wine reduce until what we call au sec, which means almost dry. Very small amount of wine remains. Wide pan like this doesn't take long, but it's a nice concentrated flavour, and it acts like a seasoning. So now we've got our stock in there, our chicken stock, and this is the base of the stew. And all we have to do at this point is let it cook, slightly thicken. Remember, we're not looking for a thick, stodgy stew. We're looking for something light. We're going to add some mushrooms too. I love mushrooms. We're going to use today a little bit of lemon juice. We're going to use a little bit of mustard. This mustard right here has no salt in. Some mustard they put salt in. Doesn't matter if it's got a little bit of salt in, but it shouldn't be at the top ingredients. If it's right at the top, they've used lots of salt in the ingredients. It should be near the bottom if you use a little bit of mustard. This is just Dijon mustard that I'm going to use. Lemon juice. I'm going to pop in some mushrooms. Mushrooms have almost no calories. The one mushroom is about 4 calories. Mind you, they will, if you use them in certain dishes, they'll suck up oil, and you can add a lot more calories to mushrooms if you put them into fatty dishes. So now we have our chicken. Mushrooms are going to cook right in there, and all we want to do is let this simmer away. Now it's not going to take long. Remember that chicken was sauteed at the start, thin skinny pieces. Won't take long to cook it. You can actually let it cook away. We're going to add our potatoes, so just cubed potatoes in there too. So you've got that nice kind of white blanquette look to it with a little bit of peppers in there. And you'll see that these potatoes that are in there, because we've cut them quite small, won't take too long to cook at all. So let's cook that away. Let's let that simmer away. I've got it on full heat. Let it thicken up slightly. And let's take a look at some seasonings that are good to use in cooking. So a seasoning that I would recommend, depending on what it is, if you're cooking with cabbage or anything like that, obviously you can use vinegar. But there's lots of different vinegar that is great for seasoning food. You can put vinegar on almost anything. Goes great with potatoes. Like even in this dish, if you wanted a slight vinegar flavor, would take away from the salt if you wanted to put it in. Something like sun-dried tomatoes. I just found these in my cupboard. They are packed in oil, so you can't get all the oil. You'll be adding a little bit of olive oil in there. But sun-dried tomatoes, dice them up. They add a nice smoky flavor to the final dish if you want. You could go with a more bold. This is a Madras curry paste. No salt whatsoever, just lots of spices. If you like a nice curry flavor, this Madras curry is quite mild, would go splendid in this particular dish. You could just put a little half teaspoon in here and it would flavor the entire dish. We know that dried spices are good. There's no salt in dried spices. You could use thyme. I've got a little cayenne pepper that you could use. I have a garlic powder that has no salt in. So you got a little bit of garlic powder that's just garlic and just dried, and that's actually quite good. You would add all these, you would add early in the cooking process, except the Madras chili paste, which you could add a lot later. Obviously, if you've got any fresh parsley or any kind of fresh herbs, you would have at the very end, and they would also take place of the salt. So lots of different things that you can use at the very end. My main thing today will be lemon juice and Dijon mustard. It's a nice Dijon mustard that will flavor the whole dish. With the lemon juice, the lemon, and the wine and everything reduced in, I'll need virtually no seasoning to put into this at the end. It'll just all cook together. The chicken should become very tender, and it's nice to serve it. You can serve it just on its own like this if you want, or you can serve it with a little bit of brown rice if you want to serve it with brown rice. So lots of great ingredients, a lot of condiments do have salt in, but take a look at where they're listed. The salt should be listed near the bottom, and then that's a good seasoning to use. So all kinds of condiments can go into dishes instead of putting straight salt in there. Let's take a look at some seasonings that we commonly use but probably shouldn't be using. Just peanut butter. Sometimes a second ingredient in peanut butter is salt. So we get a lot of salt. When we think we're getting good protein with peanut butter, we end up getting lots of salt. Cold cuts. One of the worst offenders, probably prosciutto, Serrano ham, dry cured ham. They dry it with salt, so the second ingredient after ham is going to be salt in there. So with cold cuts, sometimes you're getting too much salt in there. So if you take a look at the ingredients, you'll see that lots of salt in things like this. But even something like just a tomato sauce, a pre-made tomato sauce that you might be using to cook with pasta, third ingredient is salt. So lots of salt in there. Very expensive way to buy a tomato sauce. You're really buying salt. And then something like a barbecue sauce, you're getting sugar, you're getting salt, you're getting all kinds of things. Much better to use a different seasoning if you can. If you're out at camp, I know it's convenient, but very salty, very sugary, and it's obviously if you just put a little bit on, no big deal, but we tend to slather this on. Try not to slather too much on because it's got lots of salt. So you can see now that the dish is just starting to thicken up. We've got that that little bit of flour that was in there is just starting to thicken, and this will be the dish. As soon as the potatoes are cooked through, then everything else will be cooked. So the potatoes now should be the last thing to cook in there. Then just take a little bit of chicken and try the chicken to make sure it's cooked. I'm going to add, so when you add fresh tarragon, remember fresh tarragon will release its flavour very fast. Let me just taste that. And already lots of flavour in there without adding too much. We're going to add our lemon juice. And we're going to add just a little touch of mustard. Now remember, this mustard doesn't have any salt, so we're just going to put that mustard in. That's going to give a nice seasoned effect too. Plus the reduced wine in there, it's going to be tremendous. And this is a nice, easy dish to make. You don't have to mess around, but you can see as it cooks away and it reduces down, you see those juices are getting a little bit thicker. So my question for next week is, what's the difference between a herb and a spice? So think about that. What's the difference between a herb and a spice? And I'll let you know that next week. The other thing is, some people will tell you there's healthier versions of salt. So this is your basic table salt that you get right here, that we get in Canada. 40% sodium, as we said. So is there a healthy version? Well, you can get kosher salt, you can buy sea salt, but generally speaking, they may be less processed, but they still have high sodium content. So you can't really use a sea salt and think you're not getting the sodium, you're still getting the sodium. So this is going to be the dish, and I'll just plate it for you so you can take one final look at it at the end. But and I'll post the recipe right on the screen at the end of the video. I'll see you next week on Healthy Cooking.